This is part 3 of my book. Um, Trying to think of it. I got cut off last time, so I'll start from where I left off, which was talking about the Great Recession and how the Great Recession was the fault primarily of the governments and the central banks. Sure, the banks and consumers and insurance companies, institutions helped it, but they could not have done what they did without the politicians, central bankers, urging them onwards and not putting on the brakes until it was way too late, respectively. After the Great Recession began, instead of letting the economy fix itself, something that had been done countless times over hundreds of years and had worked out just fine, the world governments and especially the central banks decided to all go Keynesian at the same time. They decided to throw out fiscal responsibility and free market economics, and they would buy their way out of the Great Recession. And they kept blathering on about how it worked for FDR and the New Deal during the Great Recession back in the 1930s. Wrong. The New Deal did not work. And it astounds me just how many people, even experts, have gotten this outlook on history completely wrong. The evidence? There were 2 depressions during the 1920s and 30s in America, the world. But I'm focusing specifically on America here because it was the largest economy and I know it well. The 1920-21 Depression and the Great Depression of the 1930s. Let's look at the first one. The 1920-21 Depression was handled by the governments of the day under Presidents Wilson, despite his massive stroke in October 1919, and Harding, who then died, and then Coolidge took over, by basically cutting taxes, spending, and balancing the budget. And the Federal Reserve actually raised interest rates to stop the huge deflation that was going on. The result? Within 3.5 years, the unemployment rate was back to near pre-crash levels, 1.4% before, 2.4% after 3.5 years. The Dow took longer, but within 5.5 years, it was back to the pre-crash highs. And the national debt, by the end of 1925, had actually been cut by almost 25%, which of course ends, once and for all, the ridiculous notion that you have to buy your way out of a recession, depression. Fast forward to the Great Depression, and how did POTUS's, Presidents of the United States, Hoover and FDR handle it? Almost exactly the opposite. They both spent like mad. FDR especially put huge controls on the economy, all in an attempt to buy their way out of the Great Depression. The result, by 1939, 10 years after the 29 stock market crash, the unemployment rate was still 5 times higher than it was before the crash. Not 5% higher, 5 times higher. The Dow never got to more than 52% of its pre-crash high. In fact, it took 25 years before it got back to its pre-1929 crash high. And the U.S. national debt went up by almost 150% during that time. And this is the amazing New Deal that so many economists claim worked so brilliantly. Anyone who reads the above, and they are the facts, and comes to the conclusion that the New Deal was a success is, in my opinion, either illiterate or a macroeconomic ignoramus. How the F can you say that the New Deal was great when the unemployment rate ended up 5 times higher than it was before the crash? The Keynesian knuckleheads will probably say, if they hear this, that, when the New Deal started in 1933, the unemployment rate was 24.9%, and it was down to 14.3% by 1937. That is true, but they're leaving out a bunch of facts. 1, the New Deal got the economy completely dependent on the government stimulation, so much so that when the government tried to take it away in 1938, the economy collapsed again and the unemployment rate went back up to 19.2%. 2, the unemployment rate, UR, before the stock market crash of 1929 had been only 3.2%. So all this massive government stimulus control before the New Deal, control from the New Deal was get the UR back down to over 4 times higher than it was before the crash, all with a massive jump in the national debt. And you are proud of that? Are you macroeconomically delusional? If you compare the 1920-21 Depression and the Great Depression and how they were both handled, the conclusion is obvious for anyone with half a brain and an open mind. The latter was handled far worse than the former. The New Deal and Wilson And Wilson had spent loads before FDR took office and passed the horrific Smoot-Hawley Act, which partly destroyed international trade, was a huge failure. It surely made the recovery far slower than it would have been had Wilson and FDR just left it alone. Plus, it resulted in a gigantic rise in the national debt. Fast forward to the 2000s and the Great Recession, and the numbskulls in the government's central banks look back to 20th century history, and of the two prime examples they had to choose from, they chose the one that sucked and implemented a semi-version of it. They threw huge amounts of government money at the economy, bailed almost everyone out, and then the central banks decided to deliberately stimulate the stock markets. I guess they figured another housing bubble bust was not a good idea, so they apparently thought it was time to try their hands at the equity markets. So they lowered rates to astoundingly low levels, zero interest rate policy, or ZIRP, and started pumping up the markets with quantitative easing, or QE. The result, big corporations took out huge loans at tiny interest rates and bought back their own stock, i.e. stock buybacks. Why? Two main reasons. First, buying back their own stock usually raises its price as a stock in demand usually goes up. And second, this would raise the value of their corporations and make them lots of money without having to do a bloody thing otherwise. And since the Fed, in America's case, had promised to be all in and would do whatever it took to raise the markets, this practically guaranteed that the equity markets would rise. So this encouraged the corporations to take out more loans and buy back more stock. And this is primarily what has driven the stock markets through the roof since 2009. It is not because the economy is so strong. It is largely because the central banks are guaranteeing that the markets will rise, so everyone is throwing all the money they can get their hands on at the equity markets. But wait, the U.S. unemployment rate before the COVID-19 pandemic started up was down to a minuscule 3.5%. So things must be great, right? Wrong. The U3, the term for the United States official unemployment rate, is a joke. Or as Donald Trump rightly put it during the 2016 election campaign, a hoax. In 1994, the U3 was changed so that huge groups of people were no longer counted. They were called discouraged workers. Basically, if you do not have a job, want a job, and are ready immediately to take a job, but have stopped looking for work, you are a, quote, discouraged worker, unquote. And you do not count as unemployed, even though you probably stopped looking for work because you have looked and looked and there is nothing around, and you have to make other arrangements like go back to school or take jobs under the table. Before 1994, if you did not have a job, wanted a job, and were ready to work, you were unemployed. Sounds logical to me, but not anymore. Why did they do this? Simple. The less unemployed people, the lower the unemployment rate, and the better the economy looks. They say it was for other reasons. They are wrong or lying. So since 1994, the U3 has been a joke. What is another way to measure unemployment in America? A good way is the employment to population ratio. It is a simple statistic and is, in my opinion, very effective. And what does it show? Well, it shows, and I'll leave a link in the description. What does it show? Well, it shows that the employment situation is actually worse now than it was before the Great Recession. And when I say now, I mean before the COVID-19 pandemic. Right before the Great Recession began, the employment population ratio, EPR, was 62.9%. The higher the better, by the way. Before the COVID-19 pandemic began, it was at a post-Great Recession high of 61.2%. That means that despite the giant stock market boom and the trillions of dollars the Fed had thrown at the banks, equity markets, and the trillions more in stimulus and deficit spending the POTUS's George W. Bush, mostly Obama, and Trump had thrown at the economy, there was still a lower percentage of Americans employed at the end of 2019 than there was before the Great Recession began back in 2008. And by the way, the U.S. national debt at the end of fiscal year 2007, when the Great Recession began, was just over $9 trillion. As of the end of the 2019 fiscal year, it is just over $22 billion. Sorry, it was just over 9 trillion at the end of the fiscal year 2007. As of the end of 2019 fiscal year, it is just over 22 trillion, not billion. That would be nice. So a lower percentage of Americans are working, yet the national debt has more than doubled in that time. And that is a success? No, it is miles from a success. It is a galactic failure. But since the key statistics, like the U3, are skewed and the stock markets are being propped up by the Fed, the ignorant masses, who know little about macroeconomics and believe what they are told, assume things must be great. This is also why the wealth gap is exploding. The wealthy are making literally fortunes in the stock market, while the middle class is shrinking and the poor class is growing since they're working less and own little to no stock. Don't believe me that the poor are growing in size? Check the food stamp numbers. Yes, they have gone down since the height of the Great Recession. But, like the true unemployment numbers, they are still way worse than before the Great Recession. And I'll post a link in the description. The Great Recession began in December 2007. In 2007, the number of people on food stamps was 26,316,000. In 2019, that number is much higher at 35,703,000. If that is not proof that the poor are missing out on this booming economy, nothing is. Oh, and you big government lovers, save the nonsense about, well, the standards to get on food stamps were lowered and that is why more people are on it excuse. Yes, the standards were lowered a bit, but that does not even begin to explain the fact that almost 33% more Americans are on food stamps now than before the Great Recession, despite America's supposed booming economy. Oh, and by the way, another interesting stat is the M2 money velocity. This basically tells you how fast money is changing hands. When it is up, money is moving around quickly, and usually the economy is doing well. You get your paycheck, you buy something with it, the company you bought it from buys more inventory with your money, and so on. When it is down, money is not changing hands much. You use almost all your paycheck to pay your bills, debt charges, and buy little with it, or you are throwing it in savings because you're afraid the economy is getting worse. And that usually means a recession or depression. Since 1959, the M2 money velocity ratio reached its peak. I'll put a link in the description. High is good in 1997. It dropped some, but then reached another peak in 2006. Then the Great Recession happened, and it understandably dropped. It bottomed out in 2009 and started going back up again until 2010. But then a funny thing happened. It started falling again. Even though the economy was growing slowly, it kept falling. So much so that by the end of 2019, it was at its lowest level since at least 1959. Now, why would that be? Because people are not driving the economy over the last 10 years with solid macroeconomic fundamentals. They are driving it with cheap debt. So instead of buying a new car with your paychecks, you are buying it with cheap loans, lines of credit, or leases. And since so many people are up to their eyeballs in debt, their paychecks largely just go to debt servicing. They go from their bank to the debt payment, and they stop. Less velocity. Why do you think the stock markets freak out whenever the central banks talk about raising rates? Because the entire market and the economy is based on cheap debt. And obviously, this cannot go on forever. And when it stops, it will be a nightmare. And this is not just in America. This is all over the world, more or less. Canada, the EU, China, especially Japan, all living for today on cheap debt. This is monumentally foolish and will surely result in an economic mess that will make the Great Recession look like a blip. Though it could take a while because the central banks of the world have a lot of weapons up their sleeves. They can print almost as much money as they want, so they can keep thinking of newer and stupider ways to prop up the economy. This COVID-19 pandemic has shaken things up, but when it peters out, I assume the markets will go back to their race to the sky on their rocket ship of debt. So this debt party could go on for many years to come. But the faster it ends, the more, and the world gets back to solid fundamentals and living within its means, the less the nightmare will be when the debt bubble explodes. Also, in addition to this ignorance on the part of the masses, they also seem utterly clueless that the wealthy powerful are doing fantastically well. Just look at the equity market since early 2009. While the middle poor classes are being left behind. Well, I said that one wrong. Also, in addition to this ignorance on the part of the masses, they also seem utterly clueless that the wealthy powerful are doing fantastically well, while the middle poor classes are being left behind. And they seem completely oblivious to it. The masses do seem to realize that something isn't right, but the government tells them the joke, unemployment rate is low, and the stock markets are booming, so the economy is great, even though the GDP growth is tepid at best. And considering the trillions of dollars of debt being thrown at it by government central banks, it's actually doing pretty lousy. And the masses buy it, hook, line, and sinker. The ignorant masses will see that they are falling behind, so they do think something is wrong, but what it is, they wonder. While the left is starting to blame free enterprise and big business. They think the solution is to force the wealthy to give up their money and socialize everything. They seem to forget that this has been tried in many socialist communist countries, and it failed every time. But they are desperate. And the right want to blame foreigners and illegal immigrants. They want to shut the borders and make their country pure again. Well, that is just silly xenophobia. All the illegal aliens in any country couldn't disrupt the economy like the government central banks are, even if they wanted to. And both sides seem to dislike free trade and want protectionism. Again, big mistake. Free trade benefits the poor people the most, as it allows cheaper imports to enter and thus allows their limited budgets to go further. The last time America tried protectionism was Smoot-Hawley in 1930, and that was a flat-out disaster. Many blame it for actually starting the Great Depression. The problem is clearly the governments are spending too much and the central banks are being allowed to go nuts. And if I had to choose the true bad guy twisting his thin mustache, it would definitely be the central banks. Central banks are disgusting institutions. Too strong of a description? I think not. Central banks are designed to prop up big banks and help out large corporations. Why? Because their friends run those businesses. Think I'm being cynical? Nope. Let's look at the most powerful central bank in the world, the Central Bank of the United States, the Fed. I bet you most Americans think it is part of the government and that its real job is to make sure that the economy is stable, inflation is low. And that is almost totally inaccurate. In reality, the Fed is a for-profit corporation with private shares, and virtually no one knows who owns them, though it is widely speculated that the major banks own most all of them. They are not part of the federal government in any way. Yes, their governors are appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate for 14 years. And the federal government technically oversees what the Fed does, in that the Fed, from time to time, tells Congress what it is up to and answers questions about these actions. But usually what happens is this. The Fed chairperson goes up to Congress and gets asked questions by politicians. The Fed justifies their actions, and if asked a toughish question, usually answers the politician with an answer loaded with a bunch of terms that the politician has probably never even heard of. Which semi-shames the politician into shutting up for fear that the Fed head will continue to talk and make the politician in question look ever more ignorant about macroeconomic terminologies. In other words, the Fed chairperson will intimidate the politician into shutting up. Please do not assume that this vast knowledge of macroeconomic terminologies means the Fed chairperson understands macroeconomics. Usually they do not, but knowing these terms makes it seem like they do. Most Fed governors are either ex-bankers or longtime bureaucrats who have spent less time in the private sector actually earning a living than the average 18-year-old American. They go to very well-respected universities, get very well-respected sounding degrees, lots of them, and then often teach at university, move on to working in government, and eventually work their way up to the Fed, all the while spending little and often no time actually in the real world of economics. Or they did the school thing as above, but instead went to work in big banks where they did a lot of bean counting, moved their way up the bean counter ladder until they were one of the head bean counters, and then ended up in the Fed. And again, never having done anything in the real world of economics except counting beans. By the way, never let a banker intimidate you. They usually know a lot about different ways to move money around and to start end loans and such. But they often know squat about how to actually run a business, though they will act like they do. They are bean counters, which means they do not understand, have the courage to go out and take chances in the real world. So instead, they figure the best way to make money and get people to respect them by running the bank that holds all the money. It's not that bean counters are not necessary, they are, but only in a very limited way. There is a good reason why you rarely hear of bean counters taking over businesses and running them well, unless the business is some sort of bank, because they generally suck at actually running companies. You see, in my opinion, business is really about emotions. If you understand emotions, can do basic math, have common sense, and can control your emotions reasonably well, the latter is a very difficult task, by the way, you can be immensely successful in business. Just think, why do people buy things other than those things that they need to literally survive? Basic shelter, food, clothing, and medicine. Other than those basic things, pretty much everything else you buy, you do so because you want to. You don't need to, but you want to. And even the things you buy that you need, like food, you often buy types of food you want rather than just what you need. You don't need ice cream or pizza or a whole ton of other delicious foods, but you want them, so you buy them. You don't need a car usually, unless you live in the country. You could probably get by with public transit, walking, bicycling, but you want a car. And in 2020, most people don't just want a car, they want an SUV. Even a house. You don't need to own an entire house. You can certainly live perfectly well in an apartment, but you want a house, and you want a chance to make money when you sell it. And on and on. Almost all the economies of the world, especially the above-average wealthier countries, run on emotion in one form or another, either directly or indirectly. For some reason, bean counters often, though not always, seem to not grasp this, especially the ones without experience in the real world. They often tend to think of economics as a numbers problem. No matter what the trouble, they seem to think that if they can just come up with the right financial model, they can fix the problem, like a recession. Common sense says that when a recession happens, that means the economy got too hot for too long and it needs to correct itself. Like going on a diet when you eat too much for too long. So you spend less, wait until the prices fall to where they should be, and then start back to normal. But big-time bankers, like at central banks, often feel like they can figure out a way around this. They, along with the professors at universities who taught them, whom are also people who live in ivory towers, assume the problem can just be figured out. They assume they know better and they can save economies all the hassle of recession and make things better right away, usually with lots of government spending. Of course, this has never worked, but they keep trying nonetheless. Arrogance is a difficult thing to cure. Now, there are two types of central bankers. One are the type that actually might want to help the economy. They are arrogant people who assume they can figure out a way to fix whatever is troubling the economy through bean counting. Of course, they are wrong, but at least they mean relatively well. Sadly, though, I think these are the vast minority of central bankers. But maybe you're asking, but surely, by the way, there's the one type of central banker. The other kind are the greedy central bankers who just want to help their buddies and themselves as much as possible. But maybe you're asking, but surely with all these degrees they have, they must know what they are doing. Nope, and I can prove it. Go back to the beginning of the Great Recession. It was ridiculously obvious that the economy was falling apart hard. Surely the Fed, with all their brilliant, amazingly well-schooled people on the board, they must know this as well. Nope. When the housing bust was beginning, the Fed was clueless what was going on and how bad it was. And we later found that out for certain when the minutes from their meetings from that time came out. The Fed minutes are always released long after they're first taken. I'll put a link in the description.